How your mind creates suffering and how to end it. Stoic wisdom. Suffering doesn't begin in your life. It begins in your mind. And the most painful part is that most people never discover this truth. They keep fighting their circumstances, their past, their relationships, and their fears, without noticing that the real battle has always been inside their own thoughts. When you finally see this clearly, something breaks open inside you. You begin to notice that every moment of emotional pain, every spiral of anxiety, every wave of insecurity is rooted not in what happened, but in the meaning your mind created around it. The story, the interpretation, the internal dialogue that never stops speaking. This is the invisible trap Joseph Nguyen exposes in Chapter 2 of his book. The mind creates suffering not because it is cruel, but because it is untrained. It generates thoughts constantly, and you have spent your entire life believing every one of them. You rarely pause to question whether a thought is true, useful, or even yours. You simply accept it, absorb it, and let it shape your entire emotional world. The Stoics warned us about this thousands of years ago. Epictetus said that people are disturbed not by events, but by the views they take of them. Marcus Aurelius reminded himself daily that the mind has the power to turn any experience into either peace or torment. Think about this. How many times has a thought ruined a day that was going perfectly fine? How many times have you replayed imaginary scenarios until your body reacted as if they were real? How many times have you believed that someone's silence meant rejection, or that a setback meant failure, or that a feeling meant something was wrong with you? None of these came from reality. They came from the mind interpreting reality through fear, memory, and old wounds. Your suffering doesn't come from life. It comes from believing the thoughts your mind produces about life. The moment this becomes clear, even slightly, a shift begins. You start to understand that you are not trapped by the world, but by the narrative your mind keeps creating. And if the mind is the source of your suffering, then the mind can also become the source of your freedom. The goal of this video is not to make you suppress thoughts, but to make you see them, to help you create distance between the voice in your head and the truth of who you are. Because once you separate the two, the suffering begins to dissolve, not by force, but by clarity. The hidden mechanism of mental suffering. Your mind creates thoughts automatically, without your permission and without your control. Most people assume that if a thought appears, it must mean something. It must reflect reality. It must reveal truth. But this assumption is the root of almost all emotional suffering. A thought is not a fact. A thought is not a command. A thought is not an identity. It is simply an event arising in consciousness. Yet the mind convinces you to treat it as something far more powerful than that. Joseph Nguyen explains that the moment you believe a thought, you give it authority over your emotional state. You give it permission to shape how you feel, how you perceive, and how you respond. Imagine a cloud passing through the sky. It has no meaning, no intention, no truth. It simply exists. But the moment you believe the cloud is a storm coming to destroy you, your body reacts. Your heart races. Your muscles tighten. Fear floods your system. Nothing happened outside of you. The only event occurred in your interpretation. This is the mechanism the mind uses to create suffering. The Stoics understood this deeply. They knew the mind has the power to invent pain out of thin air. A single thought can distort your perception so completely that you suffer more from imagination than from the world itself. This happens because the mind has one primary function: to interpret. It constantly searches for meaning, danger, and patterns, even when none exist. This is why your mind creates worst-case scenarios. This is why it analyzes past mistakes as if repeating them will change anything. This is why it turns a neutral moment into a personal attack. It is always trying to protect you, but it does so by generating stories that often have no connection to reality. Consider how many times you've suffered from something that never happened. How many nights you couldn't sleep because of an imagined outcome. How many arguments you had in your head that never took place. How many fears you carried that never unfolded. This is the hidden mechanism at work. The mind creates an internal world, then convinces you to live inside it as if it were real. The moment you believe the mind's interpretation, the suffering becomes automatic. Not because the situation is painful, but because you internalized a story that creates pain. You become trapped inside a narrative built from assumptions, fears, and memories. And without awareness, you spend your life reacting to a reality that exists only inside your thoughts. Understanding this mechanism is the first step toward freedom, because once you recognize that suffering originates in the mind's interpretations, not in life itself, you gain the power to step back. You gain the clarity to question what you once accepted without thought. And when you begin questioning, suffering begins to lose its grip. The Stoic perspective. Your mind is a storyteller, not a judge. The mind speaks with confidence, but that doesn't make it accurate. It creates conclusions, predictions, and interpretations, as if it were a wise judge delivering verdicts. But the truth is closer to this. The mind is a storyteller. It invents narratives based on fear, memory, bias, and past experiences, then presents them to you as if they were undeniable truths. Stoic philosophy teaches us that wisdom begins when you stop taking these stories at face value. Marcus Aurelius wrote that the mind has the astonishing ability to turn any experience into suffering or strength. Epictetus taught that the origin of suffering lies not in events, but in the judgments we attach to them. This means something powerful. Your mind is not showing you reality. It is showing you an interpretation of reality. And interpretations can be questioned, examined, and changed. Think about how quickly your mind creates meaning. Someone takes too long to reply, and the mind says you're being ignored. Someone speaks with a firm tone, and the mind says you did something wrong. Someone looks distracted, and the mind says they're losing interest. None of these stories are confirmed. Yet the emotions that follow feel real, because you believe the mind's story without stopping to see if there was any truth behind it. Joseph Nguyen explains that we suffer because we don't create separation between the mind's narrative and the actual moment. The mind speaks, and we obey. The mind imagines, and we react. The mind interprets, and we accept it as fact. The Stoics saw this as a fundamental mistake, confusing impressions with reality itself. They believed that a wise person pauses between the impression and the reaction. In that pause is freedom. When you realize the mind is a storyteller, not a judge, you create a crucial distance. You stop treating thoughts as commands and begin observing them with neutrality. You notice exaggerated fear, emotional assumptions, and catastrophic thinking. You see how quickly the mind jumps from a simple event to a dramatic conclusion. And instead of getting pulled into that story, you step back and question it. This shift is life-changing. It means you no longer react to every thought that appears. You no longer take emotional orders from a mind that exaggerates danger. You no longer let assumptions control your self-worth or stability. You regain the space to choose your response instead of being dragged into automatic suffering. The mind is a storyteller, but you decide which stories deserve your belief. The illusion of control, how your mind creates fear by trying to protect you. Your mind is always trying to protect you, yet this protective instinct is exactly what creates most of your fear and suffering. It constantly scans for danger, analyzes what could go wrong, and prepares for imagined threats long before anything real happens. This is the illusion of control. The mind believes that by anticipating every possible outcome, it can keep you safe. But in reality, this habit traps you inside scenarios that never unfold, making you suffer from events that exist only in your imagination. Joseph Nguyen explains that fear is not a response to life. It is a response to the mind attempting to predict life. The moment the mind tries to control what hasn't happened, it creates anxiety. When it tries to solve problems that don't exist, it creates overthinking. When it tries to prevent pain that hasn't arrived, it creates emotional paralysis. Nothing outside you has changed, yet your body reacts as if a threat is already happening. Your heart tightens, your breath shortens, your awareness narrows. This is how the mind manufactures suffering while convincing you that it's keeping you safe. The Stoics understood this clearly. They warned that fearing the future is suffering twice, once in imagination and once if the event ever truly happens. Most people live entirely inside that first suffering. They feel the pain of a future loss long before anything is lost. They feel the weight of rejection long before a single word is spoken. They feel the stress of failure long before they attempt anything. The mind treats its predictions as facts, and because you believe them, your body reacts accordingly. The illusion of control comes from a misunderstanding. You think that worrying gives you power. You believe that preparing for the worst will somehow prevent it. You believe that constantly rehearsing painful outcomes will make you stronger. But worry doesn't prevent suffering. It creates it. The moment you engage with imagined scenarios, you disconnect from the present moment where your true strength exists. Your mind creates fear by trying to control what is uncontrollable. But Stoicism teaches that your peace only returns when you redirect your energy toward the one thing that is truly yours to manage: your perception. You cannot control outcomes, but you can control how you meet them. You cannot control people, but you can control your interpretation of their behavior. You cannot control the future, but you can control the story your mind creates about it. The moment you stop feeding the illusion of control, fear loses its foundation. The moment you return to the present, instead of living in imagined futures, your anxiety dissolves. And the moment you understand that your mind's predictions are not prophecies, you reclaim your ability to respond with clarity instead of fear. This is where suffering begins to end, in releasing what your mind never had control over in the first place. The cycle of attachment, why you keep holding on to painful thoughts. Your mind does not cling to every thought. It clings to the ones charged with emotion, identity, and unfinished meaning. This is why certain thoughts return again and again, even when they hurt you. The mind attaches itself to anything that feels familiar, even if familiar means painful. Joseph Nguyen explains that suffering continues not because the thought is powerful, but because you keep feeding it with belief, attention, and identity. Attachment begins the moment you mistake a thought for truth. A single idea, "I'm not enough," "something will go wrong," "people will leave," appears in your mind, and instead of seeing it as a mental event, you absorb it as part of your identity. The mind then repeats this thought, not because it is valid, but because it believes that consistency equals safety. The thought becomes a loop becomes a habit becomes a worldview. The Stoics understood this trap deeply. They saw attachment as the greatest source of human suffering. Not attachment to people or objects, but attachment to judgments. A thought becomes suffering the moment you grab onto it and refuse to let it pass. The mind creates pain, the attachment multiplies it. You suffer not from the thought itself, but from the story you continue to reinforce. This cycle gets stronger each time you revisit an old narrative. Your mind pulls you back into moments that hurt you. It replays memories because it believes that analyzing them will keep you safe from repeating them. It creates fantasies of danger because it thinks anticipating harm will protect you from it. It attaches to insecurities because they feel familiar, and familiarity feels like control. So you keep returning to the same painful thoughts, not because you want to, but because your mind believes it must. Consider how often you relive a mistake, how often you replay a conversation, how often you pick apart a moment that already ended. The mind attaches to these thoughts Because they carry emotional weight. And where there is emotional weight, there is identity. Identity makes the mind cling even harder. If you've believed you're not enough for years, letting go of that thought feels like losing a part of yourself, even if that part has been harming you. The Stoics taught that freedom begins the moment you see attachment clearly. When you stop feeding the thought with your attention, it weakens. When you stop identifying with it, it dissolves. When you allow it to exist without merging with it, it loses its emotional force. Suffering fades not because the thought disappears, but because you stop participating in its narrative. The cycle of attachment ends when you stop believing the mind's interpretation as truth, when you begin to observe instead of absorb, when you allow thoughts to flow rather than forcing them to define you. The moment you stop clinging to painful narratives is the moment the mind's power to hurt you finally breaks. The shift of awareness. You are the observer, not the thought. There is a precise moment in your inner growth when everything begins to change, and it has nothing to do with controlling your mind or suppressing your emotions. The change happens when you shift from being the thinker to being the observer of thought. Joseph Nguyen describes this shift as the key that ends mental suffering, because the moment you recognize that thoughts arise within you, not as you, you stop being controlled by them. You begin to see them as passing events, not commands, as possibilities, not truths. Most people live trapped inside their thoughts. They believe every idea their mind produces. They fuse with every story. They allow every fear, memory, and interpretation to become a part of their identity. When the mind says you're not enough, they feel it as truth. When the mind imagines danger, the body reacts with fear. When the mind predicts abandonment, insecurity takes over. The thinker and the thought are fused into one experience. There is no separation, no distance, no clarity. The Stoics taught the opposite. They saw thoughts as impressions, temporary appearances that should be examined before accepted. Marcus Aurelius wrote repeatedly about watching his thoughts, not obeying them. Epictetus said that freedom begins the moment you question the impression instead of reacting to it. This is the same principle Joseph Nguyen teaches. You suffer not because the mind speaks, but because you believe it without awareness. The shift happens when you step back from the stream of thoughts and notice how they operate. You begin to see that the mind is constantly producing interpretations, images, and predictions. You notice how quickly it jumps to conclusions. You see how it fabricates emotional meaning from neutral situations. And you begin to observe all of this without getting tangled in it. This awareness creates space. In that space, suffering begins to dissolve. A thought appears, but you don't fuse with it. You feel anxiety rising, but you don't let it dictate your next action. You hear the familiar voice of insecurity, but instead of absorbing it, you recognize it as an old pattern resurfacing. You watch the storm instead of stepping into it. This shift changes your entire emotional experience. You no longer spiral because you no longer let thoughts pull you into their world. You stop reacting automatically because you stop believing every interpretation. You stop drowning in emotions because you stop letting thoughts shape your reality. You start to live from awareness rather than from mental noise. The moment you realize you are the observer, not the thought, the mind loses its power to create suffering. Thoughts can come and go, but they no longer define you. They no longer control you. They no longer overwhelm you. This is the beginning of inner freedom, the kind the Stoics built their entire philosophy upon. The Stoic method for ending self-created suffering. Once you understand that your mind creates suffering through interpretation, attachment, and illusion, the next step is learning how to dismantle this process. Stoicism offers a precise method for doing exactly that, and Joseph Nguyen's work aligns perfectly with it. You end suffering not by fighting your thoughts, but by transforming your relationship with them. You create space, clarity, and conscious choice where there was once automatic reaction. The first step is noticing the thought the moment it arises. Most people never reach this point because they move straight from trigger to reaction. Stoics call this instant fusion the cause of emotional turmoil. When you fail to notice the thought, you fail to choose your response. Awareness interrupts the old pattern. Just recognizing this is a thought weakens its emotional force. The second step is questioning its truth. Stoics trained themselves to pause before accepting any impression. They would ask, is this objectively true? Or is it a story my mind created? Joseph Nguyen echoes this by teaching that every thought must pass through awareness before it earns belief. The simple act of questioning dissolves half of the pain because most suffering is rooted in assumptions, not reality. The third step is removing the emotional interpretation. The mind often adds unnecessary layers of meaning. A silence becomes rejection. A setback becomes failure. A challenge becomes hopelessness. Stoicism teaches you to strip events down to what they truly are. Without the emotional narrative, the suffering fades. You see the situation clearly instead of through the distortion of fear or insecurity. The fourth step is choosing a response instead of reacting automatically. When a thought loses its authority, you regain yours. You respond from strength instead of fear, from clarity instead of panic, from intention instead of old habits. Stoicism emphasizes this as the core of personal power, the ability to respond consciously rather than emotionally. The final step is returning to the present moment. Thoughts pull you into the future or trap you in the past. Suffering lives in those places, but your power, your peace, and your stability live only in the present. Joseph Nguyen highlights that when you return your attention to what is actually happening right now, the mind's stories lose their grip completely. The present moment offers no suffering, only the mind does. This method does not eliminate thoughts. It eliminates their ability to control you. It does not force positivity. It restores clarity. It does not make you emotionless. It makes you sovereign over your emotional world. You stop being a victim of your interpretations and become the master of them. This is how the Stoics ended their suffering and how you can end yours. Letting thoughts pass, the art of non-resistance. Most of the suffering created by the mind does not come from the thought itself, but from your resistance to it. A thought arises, and instead of letting it pass through your awareness, you fight it, fear it, analyze it, suppress it, or try to control it. This resistance gives the thought power. It transforms a passing mental event into a persistent emotional storm. Joseph Nguyen explains that the moment you stop resisting your thoughts, they lose their intensity and dissolve naturally. This is the art of non-resistance. Stoicism echoes this truth with remarkable precision. The Stoics believed that nothing harms us more than our refusal to accept what already exists in the present moment. They taught that inner turmoil comes from pushing against reality, internal or external. A thought appears and the untrained mind reacts with tension. It says, "This shouldn't be here. I need to fix this. I need to get rid of this." But this effort to control or eliminate the thought only strengthens it. Think of a wave in the ocean. If you stand rigid and try to resist it, the wave knocks you down. But if you relax, let it move past you, and stay grounded, nothing happens. The wave loses all power. Thoughts operate the same way. They rise, peak, and dissolve if you allow them to move freely. They gain strength only when you fight or cling to them. Non-resistance does not mean passivity. It means clarity. You recognize the thought, allow it to be present, and refuse to engage with it emotionally. You are not feeding it. You are not suppressing it. You are simply watching it. This is what Joseph Nguyen means when he says that thoughts are only painful when you resist them. Stoicism teaches that the only things within your control are your judgments and your actions. You cannot stop your mind from producing thoughts, just as you cannot stop the wind from blowing. But you can stop yourself from being carried away by the wind. You can learn to let the thought move without attaching to it. This practice rewires your emotional patterns. You stop spiraling because you stop giving energy to every thought that appears. You stop reacting because you stop interpreting thoughts as threats. You stop suffering because you stop creating friction with what is already happening inside you. Consider how freeing this becomes. A negative thought appears, and instead of panicking, you let it pass. An old insecurity resurfaces, and instead of diving into the story, you observe it without merging. A fear emerges, and instead of wrestling with it, you allow it to exist until it fades. Nothing inside you stays stuck, because you are no longer holding on to anything. This is the art of inner peace, allowing everything to move without forcing anything to stay or leave. When you stop resisting your thoughts, the mind has nothing left to fight against. The suffering dissolves, not because the thought disappears, but because your struggle with it ends. Rewriting your inner narrative. When you stop resisting your thoughts and begin observing them with clarity, something powerful becomes possible. You gain the ability to rewrite the narrative that has been silently shaping your entire life. Joseph Nguyen explains that the mind isn't just a generator of thoughts, it is a meaning-making machine. It creates interpretations automatically, and those interpretations form the stories you live inside. The problem is that most of these stories were written during moments of fear, confusion, insecurity, or pain. They were never questioned, yet they became the lens through which you see yourself and the world. The Stoics understood this deeply. They believed that perception determines reality because what you believe determines how you feel, how you act, and what you expect. If your inner narrative says the world is dangerous, every challenge becomes a threat. If your story says you are not enough, every silence becomes rejection. If your story says nothing works out for you, every setback becomes confirmation of your worst fears. These narratives do not reflect the world. They reflect unexamined thoughts you have carried for years. Rewriting your inner narrative begins with recognizing that these stories were never objective. They were emotional conclusions drawn during moments when you didn't have awareness, strength, or clarity. A childhood memory, a moment of failure, a painful relationship, a comment someone threw at you carelessly. Your mind absorbed these experiences and turned them into identity. Without questioning them, you spent years living as though they were undeniable truths. But when you begin observing your thoughts and separating from them, you reclaim authorship. You begin to see that the story your mind wrote was incomplete, biased, or entirely inaccurate. You see how many of your beliefs were formed as protection, not truth. And once you see this, you have the power to rewrite everything: your self-image, your expectations, your relationship with fear, your understanding of what you deserve, and the meaning you give to your experiences. Stoicism teaches that you cannot always choose what happens to you, but you can choose the story you tell yourself about it. Joseph Nguyen's work reinforces this. The moment you stop believing the old narrative, a new one emerges naturally. You begin to see setbacks as lessons rather than punishments. You see rejection as redirection rather than personal failure. You see challenges as invitations to grow rather than reasons to retreat. You see yourself not as someone who is broken, but as someone who is becoming wiser through experience. Rewriting your inner narrative is not about creating a fantasy. It is about replacing assumptions with truth, fear with clarity, and old wounds with maturity. When your story changes, your entire emotional world changes with it. You stop reacting from old pain. You stop predicting danger where none exists. You stop living as the person you used to be and start living as the person you are becoming. This is the moment your suffering loses its foundation, because suffering cannot survive in a mind that tells the truth. The identity rebuild, becoming someone who no longer believes every thought. The final stage of inner transformation happens when your relationship with your thoughts becomes so clear, so grounded, that your very identity begins to shift. You no longer see yourself as the person who overthinks, who spirals, who fears the future. or who is controlled by internal narratives. Instead, you become someone who observes thoughts without internalizing them, feels emotions without drowning in them, and faces uncertainty without collapsing into mental chaos. Joseph Nguyen calls this the rebirth of awareness. The Stoics would call it the birth of inner mastery. Identity is shaped by repetition. For years, you repeated the same thoughts until they became beliefs, repeated the same beliefs until they became habits, and repeated the same habits until they became your sense of self. If your mind told you that you were weak, you believed it. If it told you that you weren't enough, you lived as if that were true. If it told you that danger was everywhere, you approached life with fear. Your identity was built from unexamined mental noise. But once you begin observing instead of reacting, your identity starts to detach from the old stories. You no longer see thoughts as reflections of who you are. They become passing patterns, not personal truths. The mind might say, "You can't handle this," and you recognize it as an old reflex, not an identity. It might say, "You're not worthy," and you see it as a leftover echo, not a fact. With this clarity, you stop being defined by the mind's interpretations and start defining yourself through conscious awareness. This identity rebuild doesn't make you emotionless. It makes you resilient. You still feel fear, but you don't obey it. You still notice insecurity, but you don't collapse under it. You still experience doubt, but you don't mistake it for reality. You begin responding from your higher awareness, not your conditioned mind. The Stoics taught that true strength comes from governing your inner world. Marcus Aurelius wrote that the soul becomes dyed with the color of its thoughts. But when you choose the thoughts you give attention to, you choose the color of your soul. You choose who you become. And this choice is the foundation of inner freedom. As you rebuild your identity, something else shifts as well. The world begins to feel less threatening. People's behavior no longer determines your worth. Circumstances no longer dictate your emotional state. The future no longer controls your present. You stop living in reaction and start living in intention. This is the person who no longer believes everything they think. This is someone who uses the mind as a tool instead of being used by it. Someone who can experience life fully without being imprisoned by mental noise. Someone who lives with clarity, strength, and emotional sovereignty. This identity is not built from fear. It is built from truth. Stoic conclusion: ending mental suffering through mastery of perception. There comes a moment in your inner journey when the truth becomes undeniable. Suffering does not come from life itself. It comes from the way your mind interprets life. Once you understand this, something inside you stabilizes. The world does not change. People do not suddenly become kinder. Circumstances do not become easier. But your perception becomes stronger, clearer, and grounded in truth rather than fear. This shift is what both Joseph Nguyen and the Stoics consider the highest form of freedom, the awakening of your inner authority. Stoicism teaches that the mind is the only thing you truly control, and everything else is outside your command. Joseph Nguyen explains that the moment you stop believing every thought, you stop giving your mind the power to distort your emotional world. When you combine these insights, a profound understanding emerges. Peace is not something you find. It is something you create through conscious perception. You now see thoughts not as commands, but as possibilities. You see emotions not as threats, but as experiences. You see challenges not as punishments, but as opportunities to strengthen your clarity. The mind still produces narratives, but you no longer fuse with them. You no longer live inside the stories your mind creates. You observe them, understand them, question them, and choose what aligns with truth. This is where suffering ends, not because life becomes perfect, but because your interpretation becomes wise. A thought that once triggered panic now triggers inquiry. A fear that once consumed you now passes through your awareness like a breeze. A memory that once dictated your identity now becomes a piece of history rather than a definition. The patterns that once trapped you, no longer hold power because you no longer participate in them. This is the Stoic ideal of mastery. You remain steady, regardless of what happens outside you. You stay rooted in the present, rather than becoming hostage to the past or the future. You respond with intention, instead of reacting from old wounds. You choose your perception, rather than inheriting it from conditioning or fear. The mind no longer dominates you. It collaborates with you. Ending mental suffering is not about silencing your mind. It is about seeing through it. It is about discovering the stillness behind the noise, the awareness behind the thoughts, and the strength that emerges when you stop running from your inner world. The Stoics called this inner citadel. Joseph Nguyen calls it awareness. Both point to the same truth. Your freedom lives within. When you master your perception, the world no longer controls your peace. The mind no longer creates your suffering, and your life becomes guided not by fear but by clarity,